The morning was quiet the way only the ocean can make things quiet. Not peaceful, not still, just quiet. The kind that wraps around you and presses in. The kind that makes your own breathing feel too loud. Richard Cole had been walking this stretch of coastline for 4 years. Same path, same boots, same eyes scanning the water like a man waiting for something he couldn't name. His neighbors had stopped asking why. His sister had stopped calling him back out to the world. Even the local fishermen, the ones who launched before sunrise and knew every rock and ripple of this bay, had stopped waving. Not out of cruelty, just because they understood. Some men were searching for fish. Richard Cole was searching for something else entirely. It was early September, and the California coast had that particular quality of light it gets in late summer, golden and heavy, like the sun itself is tired. The kind of morning that feels almost too beautiful, like the world is trying to apologize for something. Richard wasn't on foot that morning. He was in a small aluminum boat, a 12-footer he used to take out with his son on weekends before all of this. Before everything. He'd motored about 2 miles offshore, following no real plan. Just habit and instinct and the kind of restlessness that never lets a grieving father sleep past 5 in the morning. That's when he saw it. A buoy. Rusted. Orange-red. The paint peeling off in long curling strips like sunburned skin. It was one of the old navigational markers that had probably been out there for a decade or more, half forgotten by whatever agency had placed it. He'd passed it dozens of times. Maybe 100 times. But something was different this morning. Something was attached to it. He cut the motor. Drifted closer. The boat rocked gently as he leaned over the side, squinting against the glare. Beneath the waterline, just barely visible, a dark object. Rectangular. Small. Strapped to the base of the buoy with what looked like a bungee cord tangled in a nest of seaweed and barnacles. Richard reached into the water without thinking. His hand went numb almost instantly. He pulled at the object, worked it free from the cord and the growth that had built up around it, and lifted it into the light. He turned it over in his shaking hands. It was a camera. A waterproof action camera. The kind mounted on a helmet strap. Scratched. Corroded at the edges. But sealed. Intact. Richard Cole sat in that little aluminum boat for a long time, just holding it. The ocean moved underneath him. A pelican passed overhead. Somewhere in the distance, a horn sounded from a cargo ship. He didn't cry. Not yet. He just stayed at the camera and thought about the last morning he ever saw his son. Because that boy, that rusted, forgotten boy, was sitting less than 3 miles from the exact spot where Ethan Cole had entered the water 4 years ago, and never come back. What was on that camera? What did Ethan see in those final moments? And why had it taken 4 years for the ocean to give up even this much? The answers would shake Richard to his car. They would reopen a case the authorities had quietly closed. And they would raise questions that nobody, not the Coast Guard, not the investigators, not the experts, has been able to fully answer to this day. This is the story of Ethan Cole. To understand what happened on that August morning in 2019, you first have to understand who Ethan Cole was. Not who the news reports made him, the athlete, the prodigy, the missing swimmer. You have to understand who he was as a human being, because that matters. It always matters. Ethan was 23 years old the summer he disappeared. He'd grown up in a house just 4 blocks from the Pacific, in a small coastal community south of San Diego where the salt water practically gets into your bones before you're old enough to walk. His mother, Diane, used to joke that he came out of the womb already kicking in the freestyle style. His father, Richard, who had once been a competitive collegiate swimmer himself, taught him the technical strokes in the public pool at age 4. By 8, Ethan was beating 12-year-olds in local competitions. By 14, he had broken 3 junior state records. By 18, he was on the radar of the national team selectors. But what made Ethan different from most elite athletes wasn't just the times on the scoreboard. It was the water itself. He didn't just swim in it. He seemed to belong to it. Coaches who worked with him over the years all said the same thing. The boy had an almost supernatural comfort in open water. No fear, no hesitation, just total, absolute ease. His specialty was endurance. Not the sprinting events most people watch at the Olympics, the 100 meters, the 200. Ethan was built for the long haul. He competed in the 10-kilometer open water marathon swim, which takes place not in a pool but in the ocean, lakes, and rivers of the world. Athletes swim laps around a designated course, exposed to currents, waves, wildlife, and the full sensory chaos of natural water. It is brutal. It is relentless. And it is exactly where Ethan felt most alive. His coach at the National Training Center, a veteran named Marcus Webb, described him in an interview shortly after the disappearance. He said, "Ethan had what I can only call a sixth sense in the water. He could read a current before he felt it. He knew when a wave was coming before it formed. I've coached swimmers for 30 years, and I've never seen anything like it." People who knew Ethan personally describe him as quiet in the way that deep rivers are quiet, not shallow or empty, but full of movement beneath the surface. He wasn't a party kid. He didn't drink. He was meticulous about his sleep, his nutrition, his training schedules. He kept a training journal that he updated every single day, logging not just distances and times but conditions, water temperature, mental state, things he noticed. He noticed everything. He had a particular close friendship with a fellow swimmer named Jess Almeida, who trained with him at the National Center. She described him this way, in a documentary produced a year after his disappearance. "He always said the ocean has a personality, like a person, and you have to listen to it or it will do whatever it wants to you. He respected the water more than anyone I've ever met. That's what makes this impossible to understand." His relationship with his father was the kind that doesn't need a lot of words. Richard had coached him through his junior years, being in the support boat during some of his most grueling training swims. They communicated in the shorthand of people who've spent thousands of hours together in the pursuit of the same goal. A look could say 1,000 things. The last look Ethan gave his father was a wave. Just a wave from the water. An ordinary goodbye. Neither of them knew it was the last one. The day began the way Ethan's days almost always began, before the rest of the world was awake. 4:30 a.m. alarm. No snooze. He was in the kitchen by 4:40, making the protein shake he made every training day, measuring everything with the precision of a pharmacist. He ate half a banana. He checked the weather app twice, once when he woke up and once before he left, a habit Richard had drilled into him from his earliest training days. "Weather can lie to you in the first reading," his father always said. "Check it twice." The forecast for August 14th showed clear skies, light wind from the northwest at around 8 knots, water temperature 68 degrees, swells under 2 feet. Perfect. Almost textbook perfect. Ethan's planned training session that morning was a long-distance open water endurance swim, approximately 12 kilometers. Starting from the public beach access point at Pelican Cove, arcing out along a designated course that took him around a series of navigational buoys, then back to shore. He'd done versions of this route dozens of times. He could swim it in his sleep. His training protocol included several safety measures that were standard for elite open water athletes. He wore a bright orange safety vest, not a life jacket, but a thin, flexible marker that made him visible to boats. He carried a small signaling device on his wrist, a type of personal locator beacon that he could activate in an emergency. His training diary shows he also had a GoPro-style waterproof camera mounted to his swim cap strap. He'd been recording training footage regularly that summer, something his coach had encouraged for technique analysis. The support protocol was this: a motorized support boat crewed by 2 people, a training assistant named Derek Hollis and a medical monitor named Sandra Park, would be in the water by 5:30 a.m. and would follow at a distance of about 50 meters, checking on Ethan at designated midway points. Richard was supposed to be in the support boat that morning. He'd been there for the previous 2 training swims that week. But the night before, he'd pulled a muscle in his lower back moving furniture in the garage, and Ethan had firmly told him to stay home. "Dad, I've got Derek and Sandra. I've done this route 100 times. Stay home. Rest. Richard had argued. Ethan had insisted. That argument, the last real conversation they ever had, would haunt Richard Cole every day for the next 4 years. Ethan entered the water at 5:47 a.m. 3 witnesses on the beach confirmed this. A jogger named Carl Mendez, who recognized Ethan from previous training swims and waved to him. A woman named Patricia Walsh, who was walking her dog and watched him wade in. And a teenage boy whose name was never released publicly, who was already in the shallows on a paddleboard. All 3 said the same thing. He looked strong. He looked focused. He looked completely normal. He adjusted his camera. He nodded at Patricia's dog, which had run to the water's edge. He pulled his goggles down, and he swam. The support boat launched at 5:50 and headed out to begin its escort position. By 6:20, Derek Hollis noticed something. Ethan wasn't at the first checkpoint. At first, Derek Hollis told himself it wasn't unusual. Swimmers sometimes run ahead of schedule. They find a rhythm and they push. The first checkpoint was only a rough guideline. Ethan could have passed it early, or he could be running slightly off the planned line, not uncommon in open water, where currents and conditions are always slightly different from what the weather app promises. Derek made a slow circle of the checkpoint area, then a wider circle. He radioed Sandra, who was monitoring from position further along the course. She hadn't seen him either. By 6:45, the circles were getting bigger and the voice on the radio was getting tighter. By 7:15, Derek made the call to shore and reported a missing swimmer. The Coast Guard response was rapid. Within 20 minutes, a patrol vessel was in the water. Within 40 minutes, a helicopter was overhead. The beach was quietly notified. No public announcement yet, but lifeguards were positioned at all access points and the water was being observed from multiple angles. The search area was calculated based on Ethan's entry point, his planned route, the current conditions, and the maximum distance a swimmer of his ability could have covered in the time elapsed. It was substantial, covering several square miles of open water. They found nothing. Not his safety vest. Not his signaling device. Not the camera. Not even a kicked-loose goggle strap. Nothing. Search and rescue operations continued through the entirety of August 14th and into the following day. Coast Guard divers were deployed in sections of the route where the seafloor was shallow enough to make visual inspection possible. Aerial surveillance covered a radius of 12 miles. A call went out to all vessels in the area, commercial, recreational, fishing, asking for any sightings or any unusual observations from that morning. The ocean offered nothing back. Richard Cole was on the beach by 8:30 that morning, his back screaming at him the whole drive down, not caring. He stood at the water's edge with his jaw tight and his eyes absolutely hollow, and he watched the Coast Guard boats crisscross the bay, and he tried to make himself understand what he was looking at. His son was in there. Somewhere. He had to be. Ethan Cole was a world-class endurance swimmer with thousands of hours in open water. He was in perfect physical condition. He was on a familiar course in favorable conditions. He had safety equipment. He had a support boat. There was no storm. No reported rip current. No unusual weather event. How does a man like that just disappear? That question would take 4 years to even begin to answer. But even in those first frantic hours, there was one detail that investigators later found deeply troubling. A detail that didn't surface immediately. It came from a follow-up interview conducted 3 days after the disappearance. A commercial fisherman named Ray Portillo, who had been operating about 4 miles offshore that morning, reported that he had seen a small, dark, floating object between 7 and 7:30 a.m. It was in an area consistent with Ethan's planned swim route. He had not thought much of it at the time. Debris in the water is not unusual, and he had not reported it immediately because he didn't know there was a missing swimmer. When pressed about the size and shape of the object, Portillo said it was roughly the size of a brick. Dark, floating low in the water. It could have been a piece of equipment. It could have been trash. Or it could have been a waterproof camera. That detail was logged, filed, and eventually buried under the avalanche of data that gets generated when a high-profile search and rescue operation fails to find its subject. It would become significant again years later. In the days following Ethan's disappearance, the theories arrived the way they always do in cases like this, relentlessly, painfully, often without compassion. The first and most obvious theory was accidental drowning. It is, statistically, the most common outcome when a swimmer goes missing in open water. Even elite athletes are not immune to sudden physical catastrophe, cardiac arrhythmia, a cramp severe enough to cause incapacitation, sudden loss of consciousness from a condition that had gone undetected. The ocean can take a person quickly and completely, and the depth and current patterns in this area of the California coast are such that a body can travel enormous distances before surfacing, or never surface at all. Investigators pursued this theory seriously. Ethan's medical records were reviewed. His cardiologist confirmed he had undergone standard cardiac screening as part of his Olympic program preparation, EKGs, echocardiograms, stress tests. All normal. His blood panels from the previous month showed no abnormalities. There was no documented history of seizure disorder, fainting, or any condition that would explain sudden incapacitation. The second theory was shark attack. It sounds dramatic because it is dramatic, but it is not as uncommon along the Southern California coast as people prefer to believe. Great white shark activity in the area had increased notably in the years prior to 2019, driven by growing populations of the shark's primary prey. There had been 2 non-fatal shark encounters with surfers in the region in the 18 months before Ethan's disappearance. But shark attacks, even fatal ones, leave evidence. They leave blood. They leave torn equipment. They leave things behind. The utter absence of any physical evidence, not a single fragment of Ethan's safety vest, not a smear of blood, nothing, made this theory deeply problematic. Marine biologists consulted during the investigation were careful to say they couldn't rule it out entirely, but the evidence profile was inconsistent with a shark predation event. The third theory was the one that kept certain investigators awake at night. Human involvement. It was raised quietly, carefully, and then somewhat suppressed in the public narrative, partly because there was no direct evidence for it, and partly because the implications were staggering. This stretch of California coast had, in the years prior to 2019, been identified in several federal reports as a corridor of interest for maritime smuggling operations. Not the dramatic Hollywood version. This was quieter, more sophisticated. Small, fast vessels operating at irregular hours. Minimal radio communication. Routes designed to avoid Coast Guard patrol patterns. 2 such vessels had been interdicted in the wider region in the 12 months before Ethan's disappearance. Neither case was publicly linked to his disappearance. But federal investigators later acknowledged, in very careful language, that they could not rule out a scenario in which Ethan had unexpectedly intersected with an illegal maritime operation during his training swim. What that intersection might have looked like, and what its consequences might have been, was something no one was willing to say on record. Richard Cole had his own theory. It wasn't really a theory in the investigative sense. It was more of a feeling, the kind that sits in the chest and doesn't move no matter how many years pass. Something happened to his son out there. Something specific. Something that left a trace. And he believed, with the stubborn, bone-deep certainty of a father, that trace was still out there somewhere. He just had to find it. The official investigation into Ethan Cole's disappearance was closed after 11 months. The formal determination was presumed drowning. Cause unknown. No evidence of foul play. No further investigative action indicated. For Richard Cole, those words landed like a physical blow. Presumed drowning meant they were giving up. It meant they were deciding, in the absence of evidence, that the ocean had simply taken his son. It meant that without a body, without a cause, without an answer, they were filing it away and moving on. Richard was not capable of moving on. He quit his job at the engineering firm where he'd worked for 22 years. He sold the house, too big, too quiet, too full of the particular silence that comes after a loss like this, and moved into a small rental a 2-minute walk from the beach. He spent his days doing what he'd been doing since the moment of the disappearance: researching, walking the coastline, talking to fishermen, studying ocean current data, reading academic papers on how objects move through seawater in this region. He became, in many ways, a different person. The people who had known him before the disappearance described the change in ways that are hard to articulate. He wasn't broken, exactly. He wasn't shattered. He was narrowed, like a river that gets channeled into a very tight path. All of him, all his intelligence and his stubbornness and his love, focused down into this single, consuming purpose: finding out what happened to Ethan. He kept in contact with Jess Almeida, Ethan's teammate and close friend, who had left competitive swimming after the disappearance and was now working as an ocean safety instructor in San Diego. She checked on Richard regularly, visited when she could. She was one of the few people he let in. He also maintained a correspondence with Marcus Webb, the national team coach, who had never quite recovered from losing one of his most gifted athletes under circumstances he couldn't explain. Webb had quietly done his own research, reaching out to contacts in Coast Guard investigation, consulting with maritime safety experts, and had come to believe, as Richard did, that the official conclusion was inadequate. 4 years passed. Ethan would have been 27 in 2023. He would have been at the peak of his athletic career. The Paris Olympics were coming up in 2024, and there were swimmers on the national team who had trained alongside Ethan who would go on to compete there. Richard watched the trials on his small television and felt something he couldn't name. Not quite grief, not quite pride, not quite anger. Something beyond all of those. He kept walking the coastline. He kept watching the water. And then, on a September morning in 2023, with the sun low and golden and the ocean breathing its slow morning breath, he saw the rusted buoy and the small, dark, rectangular object attached to it. And everything changed. Richard brought the camera to shore trembling. He could barely hold the boat's tiller steady on the drive back to the dock. He tied up badly, had to retie it, his hands not working properly. He sat in the parking lot of the marina for 20 minutes with the camera on the passenger seat beside him, not touching it, not able to touch it. Then he drove to his rental, called Jess Almeida, and said 4 words into the phone. "I found something. Come." She was there in an hour and a half. They sat at his kitchen table, the camera between them, the curtains open and the ocean visible through the window. The camera was a model consistent with the type Ethan had been using during his 2019 training sessions, a waterproof action camera with a ruggedized housing. The model had a manufacturer-rated depth rating of 40 meters and was designed to survive significant impact. Its storage was on a removable memory card sealed inside the body. The latch mechanism was corroded but intact. Richard and Jess did not open it that day. They called Marcus Webb, who called a former colleague with contacts at a digital forensics laboratory. Within 48 hours, the camera was in the hands of specialists in San Diego who had experience recovering data from damaged, waterlogged devices. They also called the detective who had originally led the investigation, a man named Carl Brower, now retired but still reachable, who had always privately harbored doubts about the presumed drowning conclusion. Brower drove up the same day they called him. The forensics team spent 6 days working on the memory card. The housing had kept the card sufficiently sealed against salt water. The card itself had experienced significant degradation, data corruption in several sectors, but there was recoverable footage. Not all of it, not in full resolution, but enough. Enough to see what Ethan saw. On a Friday afternoon in October 2023, Richard Cole sat in a small conference room at the forensics lab with Jess Almeida and Carl Brower and watched what remained of his son's final recording. The footage began ordinarily. The sky, still deep blue from early morning. The shore receding. The sound of water, rhythmic and constant. The particular audio texture of open water swimming. The splash and pull and exhale. The brief above-water glimpse with each breath. Ethan's breathing was measured, controlled. His stroke was powerful and efficient. A camera mounted to a helmet or cap strap gives a bobbing, irregular view of the world, the horizon tilting back and forth with each stroke cycle, the water surface filling the frame in alternating flashes. You could see the buoys of his training route in the distance. You could see the support boat, a white shape about 50 meters behind. For the first 40 minutes of footage, much of which was damaged and played back in degraded quality, there was nothing unusual. Ethan swam. The ocean moved. The morning brightened. And then something changed. Richard could see it before it was obvious. He knew his son. He could read the shift in the rhythm of the stroke, a slight hesitation, a change in cadence. Ethan's head turned more frequently during his breathing strokes. He was looking at something. The audio captured a sound that was not the ocean. A low, intermittent rumble. Mechanical. Not from the support boat. The support boat's engine had a distinctive, familiar sound that Ethan knew and that would not have caused alarm. This was different. Lower in pitch. And it seemed to be coming from a different direction. Ethan paused his stroke. You could see it. A full stop in the middle of open water, treading, and he turned his head. The camera caught a shape on the water. Dark, low profile, moving. The image quality in this section of the footage was compromised, partially corrupted by the water damage to the memory card. What the forensics team could definitively determine was this: the object was not a natural feature of the water. It was a vessel. Its precise type and identification markings were not recoverable from the damaged footage. But it was there, and it was moving toward Ethan. His audio, captured by a waterproof microphone, recorded words in that moment. The audio forensics team spent days cleaning the file. The consensus on what was said was imperfect, but two technicians independently transcribed the same phrase. Ethan's voice, tighter than it had been at any point in the footage. Did you see that? And then, seconds later, in a different tone. Hey. And then the camera detached. All was detached. The remaining footage, less than 90 seconds, was shot from below the water's surface, the camera apparently sinking slowly or tumbling, the view fragmentary and dim. Shafts of light from above. Bubbles. Movement. And in the final recoverable frame, at the bottom left of the image, a shadow. Large. Moving with purpose. Not a marine animal. The shape was wrong for that. Too geometric. Too parallel to the surface. And then, nothing. The footage ended. Richard Cole sat in that conference room for a very long time after the screen went dark. No one spoke. Jess Almeida was crying quietly. Carl Brower had his jaw in his hand and was staring at the floor. The forensics technician who had been walking them through the footage had stepped out of the room. Finally, Richard said, "That's the moment everything changed." Not was. Is. Present tense. Because for Richard Cole, 4 years of waiting had not been time that passed. It had been time suspended. And now time had resumed, brutal and clarifying and utterly without mercy. The footage was analyzed by 4 independent experts over the following 3 months. A marine biologist from Scripps Institution of Oceanography reviewed the final frame and the shadow it contained. Her determination was unambiguous. The shadow was not consistent with any known large marine animal in the Southern California ecosystem. She listed the candidates: great white shark, orca, mola mola, large sea lion, and explained why the geometry and movement profile of the shadow did not match any of them. The shadow was elongated. It was approximately parallel to the surface. It moved with a sustained, directional momentum inconsistent with animal behavior. Her conclusion was precise and carefully worded. The shadow in the final frame of the recovered footage is most consistent with a submerged or partially submerged man-made object. A naval architect, a specialist in small vessel design, reviewed the audio recording and the visual of the approaching vessel. He could not make an identification from the corrupted footage, but he said the engine sound profile recovered from the audio was consistent with a high-powered inboard motor of the type commonly used in fast semi-rigid inflatable vessels. Not a recreational boat. Not a fishing trawler. Something fast, purpose-built, and low to the waterline. A forensic audio specialist confirmed the two transcribed phrases with high confidence. The third sound, which had been initially unclear, was, in her analysis, most likely the noise of something striking the water in close proximity to the microphone. Something heavy. The fourth expert was Carl Brower himself, working from his 31 years of criminal investigation experience. He reviewed everything: the footage, the audio transcription, the expert reports, and the original investigation file, including the detail about the unregistered vessels operating in the coastal corridor that year. His assessment, written in the blunt language of a man who had spent decades looking at hard truths. The evidence recovered from this camera is inconsistent with accidental drowning and inconsistent with natural predation. The recovered footage documents an unexpected encounter with an unidentified vessel during the subject's training swim. The audio record documents the subject's verbal response to this encounter. The camera detachment occurring at this precise moment is concerning. The presence of an unidentified moving object in the final frame raises serious questions about the circumstances of the subject's disappearance that were not, and could not have been, investigated at the time due to the absence of this evidence. He recommended immediate referral to federal maritime authorities. The case was formally referred in January 2024. What the federal investigation found, or did not find, is where this story enters the territory of official silence that is one of the most maddening features of unresolved cases. Federal investigators confirmed that there had been known illegal maritime activity in the corridor in the summer of 2019. They confirmed that at least 2 vessels involved in these operations had never been identified or apprehended. They confirmed that the timing and location of Ethan's training swim was within the operational range of these activities. They would not confirm anything else. There is no confirmed suspect. There is no confirmed motive. There is no confirmed scenario. What there is, what the camera gave back after 4 years in the sea, is the end of the false certainty of accidental drowning. The ending of the official story that the ocean simply took him. Whatever happened to Ethan Cole, it was not simple, and the shadow in that final frame has not let anyone rest since. There's a question that forensic scientists and oceanographers spent considerable time on after the camera's recovery. How did it get there? How did a camera that was attached to a swimmer in open water, a camera that apparently came free during a chaotic event, end up strapped to the underside of a navigational buoy 3 miles from that location, sealed in something close to intact condition, 4 years later? The most plausible explanation involves several factors working together in a sequence that is statistically improbable but not impossible. The camera's housing, though damaged externally, had kept its waterproof integrity. The memory card's internal seal had held. The camera had likely floated for some period before sinking to a depth where it was caught by the bungee cord arrangement found around the buoy. But the bungee cord is the part that doesn't fit neatly into an accident narrative. Bungee cords do not attach themselves to objects. They are not a natural element of ocean debris. The forensics team examined the cord and the attachment mechanism closely. Their finding was inconclusive. The cord was heavily degraded and could not be sourced or dated with confidence. But the way it was wrapped around the camera and secured to the buoy's lower structure suggested, to at least 2 members of the team, intentional placement. Not necessarily human placement at the time of the incident. It was possible, just possible, that the cord had been placed there by someone else, at some other time, to secure something else entirely, and the camera had simply become entangled in it over the course of its time in the water. It was also possible that the camera had been placed there deliberately. That possibility was not dismissed. There's a detail in the original incident that connects to this, a detail Richard Cole had been fixated on for years without knowing why. In the days immediately after the disappearance, a search team had checked that buoy as part of a systematic sweep of navigational markers in the area. They had noted nothing unusual, but that check had been visual only. No diver had gone below the surface to examine the underside of the buoy's base structure, which extended several feet below the waterline. If the camera had been placed below the waterline, it would have been invisible to a surface check. Richard had known, in that wordless way that grief makes you know things, that the answer was in the water. He had walked that coastline for 4 years. He had motored past that buoy dozens of times. It was only when he happened to drift close enough, at the right angle, in the right light, that he saw the dark shape beneath the surface. The ocean had kept it secret for 4 years, and then, one September morning, it chose to give it back. Or something did. There is a particular kind of grief that comes without closure. Most grief, and this is not to minimize how devastating ordinary loss is, comes with an end. A moment when the fact of the death becomes undeniable. A body, a funeral, a certificate, a grave. Something concrete that the mind can attach to and begin, slowly, to process. Richard Cole has never had that. He has lived for 4 years, now 5, approaching 6, in the particular purgatory of ambiguous loss. His son is legally presumed dead. But presumed is not the same as known, and Richard Cole is not a man who confuses those two things. He has been in therapy. He is honest about that. He is a therapist in San Diego who has worked with families of missing persons for decades, who understands the specific flavor of grief and doesn't try to rush him through it or past it. She has told him that what he is carrying is one of the heaviest things a person can carry. She has also told him that the act of searching, which many well-meaning people in his life told him was unhealthy and obsessive, was, for him, an expression of love, a refusal to abandon his son. She calls it continuing bonds. The idea that grief is not about detaching from the person you've lost, but about finding a new way to maintain your relationship with them. For Richard, that new way was the coastline, the boat, the water, the searching. He is not the same man he was before. He would not claim to be. He is leaner, quieter, more weathered. His hair, which was starting to go gray in 2019, is fully silver now. He doesn't sleep well. He doesn't sleep badly. He sleeps the way someone sleeps when they've made a kind of peace with not being at peace. After the camera's discovery and the reopening of the federal case, he gave one interview. A single, carefully arranged conversation with a journalist he trusted, conducted in his small rental with a window open and the ocean audible in the background. He was asked what finding the camera meant to him. He was quiet for a long time before he answered. Then he said, "It means he tried to tell us something. Whatever was happening out there, he saw it. He reacted to it. The camera captured it. And then the camera ended up where it ended up. And I found it. I don't know what that means. I don't know if it means anything beyond a sequence of events. But I needed there to be something. I needed the ocean to not just take him and give back nothing. And now there's something. There's a question worth asking. There's something left of what he saw." He paused. He said, he was 23. He had the whole thing ahead of him. He was going to go to Paris. He was going to stand on that starting line and look at all that open water and feel exactly what he always felt, like he was home. He didn't finish the sentence after that. He didn't need to. As of the time of this story's telling, the case of Ethan Cole remains officially open. The federal referral initiated in January 2024 has produced no public findings. The investigators involved have not given statements. The case sits in that frustrating middle distance between active investigation and stalled inquiry, technically alive, practically invisible. Carl Brower, the retired detective who worked the original case and has been Richard's most consistent institutional ally through this process, is cautiously optimistic. He believes the footage is enough to eventually compel a more thorough accounting of what was happening in that maritime corridor in the summer of 2019. He believes the vessel in the footage can ultimately be identified, or at least its type conclusively established. He believes the shadow in the final frame will eventually be explained. He is less optimistic about what that explanation will deliver in terms of justice or answers. Because the painful truth about unresolved cases, the truth that true crime narratives don't always sit comfortably with, is that evidence can tell you that something happened without telling you exactly what. It can confirm that the original conclusion was wrong without providing the right one. It can open a door without illuminating what's behind it. The camera gave Richard Cole proof that his instincts were right, that something happened out there, that it wasn't simply the ocean taking his son in the ordinary way that water takes people. It did not give him Ethan back. Jess Almeida, who still teaches ocean safety in San Diego, has talked publicly about what this case has meant for the world of open water swimming. She advocates passionately for mandatory improved monitoring protocols for elite training swims, better tracking technology, mandatory escort procedures, real-time location data that can be accessed immediately if a swimmer goes off course. She frames it as Ethan's legacy. She says, "He was the most water-smart person I've ever known. If something could happen to him, it can happen to anyone. And the community needs to take that seriously." Marcus Webb, still coaching at the national level, has said privately that he lights a candle for Ethan on the anniversary of the disappearance every year. He doesn't talk about it publicly. He doesn't need to. The three witnesses who saw Ethan enter the water on August 14, 2019, the jogger, the woman with the dog, the boy on the paddleboard, have all been contacted by journalists and documentary makers over the years. All three consistently describe the same image: a young man, strong and focused, wading into the water in the early morning light. Looking ahead, looking ready, not looking afraid, not looking like a man who had any reason to believe that morning would be different from any other. There is something the ocean does that no other force on Earth quite replicates. It takes things, it holds them, and then, sometimes, in its own time, by its own logic, for no reason a human being would recognize as a reason, it gives something back. A message in a bottle, a piece of a ship, a personal belonging from a crash that happened decades ago. The sea returns things at its own pace, in its own way, and what it returns is never quite the whole story. Just a fragment. Just enough to remind you that the whole story exists somewhere, in the deep and the dark and the cold. Richard Cole found a fragment. He found 9 to 7 seconds of footage, partially corrupted, incomplete, maddening in what it shows and what it withholds, that confirmed his worst fears and validated his refusal to accept the easy answer. He found a shadow that no one has been able to explain away. He found his son's voice, preserved in degraded audio, saying two things that will live with him for the rest of his life. Did you see that? Hey, two small words, a greeting or a warning, depending on what, or who, they were directed at. The forensics team cannot determine which. The context does not allow for certainty. Richard Cole watches that footage on a laptop in his small rental by the water. He has watched it more times than he can count. He knows every frame, every degradation artifact, every place where the image breaks up and reforms into something close to visible. He watches the moment when Ethan stops swimming. He watches the moment when the camera catches the shape on the water. He watches the moment when everything goes underwater and the light above becomes something distant and wavering. And he watches the shadow. He has said that watching the footage is both the hardest and the most necessary thing in his life right now. It is hard because it shows him the last moments of something he cannot undo. It is necessary because it is, for now, the closest thing he has to his son's account of what happened. A young man swam out one August morning. He was at the absolute peak of his physical life. He was doing what he was born to do, in the water he loved more than anywhere on Earth. And something happened. Something that a camera, sealed in the dark and the cold and the deep for 4 years, managed to partially record. The case is open. The shadow has not been identified. The vessel has not been found. And Ethan Cole has not come home. But the camera found Richard. Or Richard found the camera. After 4 years of walking the same stretch of coastline, of motoring past the same rusted buoys, of refusing to accept that the ocean could simply take his son and leave nothing, a September morning came along and the light was right and the angle was right, and there it was. A small, dark, rectangular object, full of a story the sea had been keeping. The ocean is vast and it is cold and it does not care about us the way we wish it would. It does not owe us answers. It does not respond to grief or justice or the love a father carries in his chest like a stone. But sometimes, not always, not often, not on any schedule we can predict, it gives something back. Richard Cole is still waiting for more. He goes out on the water every morning when his back allows it. He watches the boys. He is still looking. If you found yourself in that aluminum boat, holding that camera, knowing what it might contain, would you open it? And if you were Ethan, out there in the water, seeing what he saw, what would you have done? Some questions don't have comfortable answers. This case is full of them. If this story stayed with you, if Ethan's story deserves to be remembered and his case deserves to be pursued, then share it. Talk about it. Because the loudest thing Richard Cole has said through all of this is not something he put into words. It's the fact that he kept going back to the water every single morning, refusing to stop looking. That, more than anything, is what love looks like when it has nowhere else to go.